Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today is a big day. There's a lot of news going on in the world about the decision of Putin yesterday to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk, the provinces of eastern Ukraine that have, he claims, were never really a separate country, that the Ukraine should never have been independent in the first place. But so now he's going to recognize these two breakaway republics. Okay, that is not quite like a declaration of war, but it's getting there. So we definitely have a lot to on our minds now. But this is a schmooze day, and schmooze day is a time when I don't dictate what we're going to talk about. In fact, nobody knows for sure what we will discuss when we get together, because there's a no agenda plan, and we ask people what they're thinking about or concerned about. So I have two guests with me today. James Simeon is the head of McLaughlin College at York University. He's a political scientist, and he's recently published a book, which he edited, about, I've forgotten the title. James, what is the title? Let's give it right now.
Serious international crimes, human rights, and forced migration.
Serious international crimes, human rights, and forced
migration.
Very important topic. And in Kingston, Ontario, at home, I am glad to have a chance to say hello to John Foster. Afternoon.
Greetings to you.
Good to see you again. We're going, I'm sure, to talk about your favorite topic, the thing that you spend your life studying most, which is pipelines around the world, because one of the big events of the day is that the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, has apparently canceled or frozen something about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was going to deliver Russian natural gas to Germany. And Germany is almost dependent on that source of gas. So it's going to be an interesting challenge for the country if they have to start doing without Russian gas. Now, this is a schmooze day, so I've already violated the terms of the schmooze by saying what I want to talk about a little bit. So let me get it out of my way, and then I can return to the norms. I want you, first off, if you will, please, to tell me a little bit about what you know, John, about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the German decision of, I guess, last night.
Fine. First of all, what is the pipeline? It's a gas pipeline that has been completed and not yet started operation. That goes from Russia, near St. Petersburg, roughly speaking, to Germany in that little corner close to Denmark, again, roughly speaking, under the Baltic Sea. And it parallels an existing pipeline that has been in operation for 10 years, which is Nord Stream 1. It's often called these are often called Russian projects. In fact, they're joint European and Russian, roughly speaking, 50-50 in the financing of in both cases. And Nord Stream 1 doesn't seem to have been controversial in the way that Nord Stream 2 is. Nord Stream 2 has been bitterly opposed in its construction and now in its certification and startup, not yet happened, by the United States and by the two countries in Eastern Europe through which gas currently flows and historically has flowed big time to Europe, which are Ukraine and Poland. Now, Angela Merkel, in her final months as Chancellor of Germany, had visited, this is in July of last year, Washington, and reached an agreement with President Biden that she resisted the US pressure that the line be cancelled, which I guess means completely scrapped, shut down, that's it. Unless there were a war unless Russia were to attack Ukraine. And so that's more or less where it lay. And on that basis, the US desisted theoretically from sanctions on that pipeline, which they previously had in place in its pipeline laying. Well, now the game is about certification.
Can I interrupt? Because one of the questions is, did she say that they would cut it off if Russia attacked Ukraine? Or my impression was that they left it ambiguous whether or not they would actually cut it off. And now looks like they mean business. Am I correct?
Yes, I would say so. There's a change of government in Germany, and Chancellor Scholz was recently in Washington a couple of weeks or so ago, and he was at a joint press conference with President Biden and asked 3 times by the press whether he would outright cancel the pipeline in the event of a Russian invasion or Russian attack on Ukraine. And each time he basically ducked it, and they sensed he was ducking it in his reply. He was saying, yes, my paraphrase, we're with the United States, we're on the same page when it comes to the need for strong sanctions on Russia in the event of an attack. But he refused to say the magic words Nord Stream 2. Now what has happened? Of course, yesterday there's this dramatic announcement by President Putin, and then his signing of these decrees recognizing formally the 2 breakaway republics which constitute the Donbass of Ukraine, namely Donetsk and Lugansk. So I read this morning, what has happened to Nord Stream 2 in all this? Has it been cancelled? Which I think has been the quick, fast headline way of reporting. What I see is that Chancellor Scholz has ordered the withdrawal of the certification, halting of the certification process. In these crisis circumstances, were the words that Deutsche Welle reported it this morning in print. And I looked at TASS too to see what the Russians might be reporting it. And it's in my reading of it all, more or less the same. So then that led me to say, does that mean an outright cancellation of the pipeline, which obviously is what the United States, Poland, and above all Ukraine would like? I don't see that unless you or James have better insights than I as to what's been going on. It's a fast-moving game, and I've just seen those 2 articles. So which raises all sorts of other questions, which is what happens now without it? What happens in the event of an attack what would it constitute to make for an outright cancellation? What would the Russians have to do that's bad? So I could interrupt. I could stop myself at that point if you wish.
Well, no, I was already speculating with James before you came on about the fact that, well, I thought it was a fact that he'd sort of frozen it. Now, I don't know what the word is for it, but interrupting the certification process. Well, I don't know what the certification process was, because it wasn't making any progress anyway, as far as I know. For several months, they were ready to start, sending stuff through that pipeline, and they haven't done it because I don't know what they were waiting on. But so this is just another pause on what was already a pause, so far as I know. But what I'm thinking is you don't want to use your entire arsenal of weapons before you really need to, as a retaliation. So if all these countries, Western countries, want to punish Putin for making a war, then they should not use up all of their weaponry before he even launches the war, because I mean, there is a war going on, but it's certainly not the scale that he's threatening right now with all those, troops surrounding Ukraine. So he could actually invade, the main part of Ukraine. And then if let's say Schultz had already squandered his entire means of retaliating, maybe he's just conserving his resources for a day when they would be more needed.
My reading of the thing is that there's a very split view within Europe, let alone within NATO, on Nord Stream 2 and whether it's wanted or not. Apart from the crisis started yesterday, and France and Germany and a few others very, very much want this pipeline, and they also need gas. Europe needs gas for heating and for its industry, and the gas reserves right now, the stuff down in the inventories, the stuff down in the ground in Germany and Austria and elsewhere, Russia, Ukraine, are very low. In Europe, I'm told it's in the single digit figures. They're running out of gas, and so if Nord Stream 2 obviously hasn't yet started, is on hold, there's a risk of the gas flowing through Ukraine itself being cut, not severed physically, but just shut off for safety in the event that it became a conflict zone, to shut down the pipelines. In which case, Europe is stuck with a devil of a problem. So the United States has been touting the idea that there's alternative gas from other places, not least from the United States, which is dying to sell its LNG, liquefied natural gas, into Europe. And the United States has become the world's largest producer of gas and one of the largest exporters of gas. It could become the largest. Well, it's not enough. And the European...
the U.S. Resources wouldn't make up the difference.
Absolutely not. Not even if you had Qatar on top. And furthermore, these cargoes are needed elsewhere too. Asia. China has a voracious appetite for natural gas, both in LNG and also pipe gas from Russia, which it now gets. So either way, if you knock Russia's gas out from Europe, what you're going to see is a huge spike in prices and through the in inflation, and it would hit industry. It would be conceivably a disaster for the European economy. In other words, I increasingly think that it'll hurt Europe much more than it would ever hurt Russia. Russia also has a huge war chest in the sense of foreign exchange reserves, and it's been coining it in with oil prices and gas prices on the rise.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think I should try to return to my usual standards of being quiet and inviting my guests to actually do the talking. So, James Simeon, tell me what's on your mind these days.
Given the situation now with the crisis in the Ukraine, is the number of armed conflicts that are taking place in the world. And I guess this is one example. And looking at various reports like Alert 2021, which reports on armed conflicts, human rights, and peacekeeping, there were some 34 armed conflicts in the world, most of them within Africa, Asia, Middle East, but all continents. And this has led to, of course, huge numbers of forcibly displaced persons in the world. And one of the consequences, and we see a little bit of that right now in terms of the Ukraine, the contested areas where Russian forces are moving in, as Meta has pointed out, people being bussed out of those areas. And so one of the consequences of armed conflict is, of course, forced displacement, people being displaced. And if you look at the figures of UNHCR, UNHCR has indicated that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of the world's refugees over the last decade. Mm-hmm. And they report that as of June of 2021, we were at 84 million people that were forcibly displaced in the world. And this is really troubling, even when you consider the situation with the pandemic, which led to borders being closed and restrictions in terms of travel. People are still seeking asylum. And one of the things that's forcing all of this, of course, the pandemic is contributing to this in part because of the economic stagnation that's occurring in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And also at the same time, of course, the political instability that's being caused in terms of the economic and social hardships.
Excuse me, but when did you say 80 million?
84 million.
84 million. Now, I presume that that's both internally displaced and people who are real refugees to other countries. What is the ratio between internal? I'm thinking, for example, of the stories that we're seeing now about the people in Afghanistan who are, I'm not sure how many of them are displaced, but they're certainly having a hell of a time.
Absolutely. If you look at the ratio, it's about 26.4 million refugees in the world. Uh-huh. And in terms of the internally displaced, there's about 48 million. So it's clearly about double the number of refugees in the world. And of course, the breakdown between the refugees themselves, there's about 5.7 million that are Palestinian refugees that come under the auspices of UNRWA, which is the UN Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, and then the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 20.7 million. And then, of course, there's also asylum seekers, which the figure is about 4.1 million. And and these are figures for 2020 that I have. I don't have the current breakdown for 2021 yet. That hasn't come out yet. But you can see the ratio between the refugees and the internally displaced. And the important thing to keep in mind is the difference between refugees and internally displaced are people that actually cross an international boundary. So once you cross an international boundary, then you can be a refugee. But if you're only displaced in another part of your country, you're internally displaced.
I presume that it was pretty reasonable to assume that they're not all of these people are in equally desperate conditions. These numbers that you've cited would include the Palestinians living in Jordan, right? Who have almost assimilated, I presume. I mean, I don't know, but I don't think that they are in the same predicament as some of the people living in, tents with, desperate.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, the Syrian war has been ongoing now for over a decade. And there are about 13 million Syrians that have been forcibly displaced. And if you look at, the figures of UNHCR, 5 countries in the world account for over 2/3 of the world's refugees. And the countries are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And
those are the sources. Oh, okay. I was thinking those were the places people went. No.
Those are the countries of origin.
Okay. And where do most of these people from these countries go? I mean, we can guess, but.
Yes. I mean, the Syrians try to make their way to Europe, but most of them end up in neighboring countries. And as a matter of fact, something like 73% of all the world's refugees are in a neighboring country. So for Syria, they seem to congregate in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. So most of the people that are forcibly displaced don't get very far. Those with the means obviously can move forward. And you've seen all of the pictures of the people that are traveling on boats, the overcrowded boats. They're trying to cross the Mediterranean to get from Turkey to one of the Greek islands, or are, traveling across train tracks, going from one country to another country in various groups, or the caravans that are moving up through Mexico to the US border in various groups. So those are the pictures that we see in the media in terms of this. But most of the world's refugees don't travel far. They just go to a neighboring country. And since most of the armed conflicts are located in the global south, in these developing countries, they really don't go very far. 86% of the world's refugees are actually in developing countries. Mm-hmm. They don't make their way to the global north. And
well, I mean, isn't that a nice way of really saying the North won't let them in? I mean, we have to be more generous and proactive in bringing people than we obviously have been. I mean, the case of the people fleeing from Afghanistan, to whom Canada has obligations. That is very disturbing. In fact, it is so hard for these people to get into Canada when they have put their lives at risk to help Canadian.
Yes, I mean, last August, when the United States and NATO decided that they would get out of Afghanistan, and the chaotic departure from Kabul, and over that period of time, that maybe 2-week period of time, there was something like 113,000 people that were taken out of Afghanistan and taken to neighboring countries, and then eventually making their way to different locations. But now the situation there is desperate because the Afghan economy has collapsed. There are many other people there that want to leave Afghanistan. I think Pakistan has also deported a number of the Afghans that were staying there.
Deported them, really?
Yes, some 360,000 people. I've read that Pakistan is deported. And
where, back to Afghanistan, or where do they send them?
Yeah, I guess back to Afghanistan. And
isn't that illegal? I mean, international law says if people need to leave, you can't throw them back to where they came from, right?
That's absolutely right. But there you are. That's what's happening in the world today. And the situation in Afghanistan is really highly precarious, especially for the individuals that are left there that had any affiliation or association with the Allied forces that were there along with the Americans. So I know that there are efforts made to try to get these Afghans out of the country. I'm not sure how successful they're going to be, but that's a cause of real concern. As you know, with the Taliban in control in Afghanistan, it's really created a horrible situation for all of the women in that country. And there were women judges, there were women professors and so on, and they're now not able to practice their profession. And in fact, they have to stay at home. It's really a very horrible situation that's taking place.
Well, as for the people who want to leave, what do the Taliban, what is their position on that? Do they, they could say, well, good, go. We're happy to get rid of you if you don't want to be here. Or they can say, I suppose at the other extreme, if you even think of trying to leave, we'll kill you, or, something serious. How dangerous is it for people who have been on the outs with the Taliban and who feel they need to leave for political reasons? For how dangerous is their situation there, especially if they try to get out? And
I think
you know,
it's extremely dangerous, their situation. Many of these people are in hiding. There are efforts to try to locate them. They're searching these individuals out. It's very much a retaliation now because they were supporting the Americans, or they were supporting the British and the other allies that were in Afghanistan. You also have to keep in mind it's a very fractured society with various groups that are battling each other as well. I think it's a very extremely dangerous situation in Afghanistan, and it's very difficult for people to get out.
mhm,
Um, so generally, if you look at the situation in the world today, most of these armed conflicts that are taking place are internal armed conflicts. So I listed 34 previously. 28 of those are internal, but they're also internationalized, which means that there are other international state or other states that are involved in these internal conflicts. And I guess Syria is a classic example of this, where you have Russians, Americans, French, British, and others that are involved in that conflict. Um, we also have international armed conflicts, and the situation in Ukraine clearly is an international armed conflict that's escalating. Hopefully, diplomacy will be able to resolve that difference. But I'm not encouraged by John Foster's comments in terms of Nord Stream 2 and the dire situation in terms of the supply of gas in Europe and the kind of economic and political instability that might result as a consequence of the shortage of the gas supplies. But I guess my major overall concern is that there's been a steady escalating increase in the number of people that are forcibly displaced in the world. And this is clearly due to a number of factors, but the principal cause, if you look at the 68% of the world's refugees coming from these 5 countries, most of these countries, with the exception of Venezuela, which is a crisis situation in its own in terms of, again, I guess, John, you could say that it's the price of oil, because Venezuela was so dependent in terms of its GDP, in terms of the price of oil. And when that dropped dramatically, it had economic consequences. But there are all sorts of other political reasons, corruption and so forth, that have contributed to the situation and has forced people to leave Venezuela. Most of those people have been going to Brazil. They've been going to other countries in Colombia and in other countries within Latin America and South America specifically. Ecuador is, example, another country where they're moving into and then making their way north into Central America as well. But if you look at Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, these are all examples of protracted armed conflict, and that have contributed to the escalating numbers of people that are forcibly displaced. Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General to the United Nations, has pointed out, and this was when he was still the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, said that our capacity to deal with the number of the world's refugees has reached its limit. And we
no,
can no
but we're
longer
only
address to the.
we only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the number of refugees that are going to be coming because of global warming. We know that Bangladesh is going to be underwater practically. What are you going to do with, where are they going to go?
Well, that's absolutely right. Climate change is contributing to all sorts of things in terms of not only ocean levels rising and islands disappearing, but it's also creating all sorts of flooding that is displacing individuals in various locations. Hundreds of thousands of people in China, Malaysia, South Sudan, and other areas have been forcibly displaced as a consequence of climate change. So that's another contributing factor in terms of the number of people that are being forcibly displaced. But if you want to address the problem in terms of the world's refugees, I would argue that really we have to be focusing on peacekeeping. We have to be focusing on ending the protracted armed conflicts that have led to millions of people being forcibly displaced. Syria is a prime example, 6.7 million people forcibly displaced across the borders. That doesn't include the number of people that are forcibly displaced inside Syria. And they say that the borders within Syria are being closed. That's limiting the number of people that can actually leave the country. And as a result, they're trapped, if you will, within that ongoing armed conflict. And Afghanistan has been at war for years and years, decades. And likewise, Sudan and South Sudan have been problematic. So if we can't resolve these kinds of armed conflicts, then obviously we're not going to be able to resolve the refugee problem.
In the case of Venezuela, I'm just struck. Yes, they're being saved right now in terms of foreign exchange by the high oil prices that have come back. To the extent
I'm sorry,
the
the Venezuelan government is being saved by high oil prices?
by the high oil prices, which are now reaching, in the case of, depends what your yardstick is, what which crude oil, but you call it approaching towards $100 a barrel again, US. But the Venezuelans have the issue that how do they get the oil to market with the US imposing sanctions on them? Certainly they can't get their heavy crude oil to its natural market, which is the export market, which is the United States itself. That they to those Texas and Louisiana refineries that were designed to process Venezuelan crude. Instead, they're taking Albertan dilbit, diluted bitumen. So, if you like, Canada wins at the expense of these sanctions. The other thing that I wonder about, in the case of these armed conflicts, who started them or who egged them on? I'm very struck that, quite apart from the internal dynamics that might make for war, that what do I think? Countries are very like eggs, Humpty Dumpty on the wall. If they fall off, it's a devil of a job to put them together again. I think we see that in Ukraine, but in these other countries too. And I see the big powers stirring it up, particularly now. It used to be the Soviets and the Americans and whatnot. Now I see it's been very much the big hegemon to the south of us in the case of various of these countries, whether it be war, whether it be economic sanctions, which is another form of war. But what interests me in the case of Ukraine is this. It's always a question, where do you start the clock in discussion? But as regards the present crisis, it seemed to me that one could start the clock at last November, October, November, when the Russians came on pretty strong, Putin and co, of expressing that, like way of putting it, of being fed up basically of being ganged up on by the West, the containment. And so they pointed very, very strongly to the the OSCE, Helsinki Act, the Treaty of 1975. They pointed to the updates, the declarations that happened in 1997 and 2010, which is in Turkey and Astana. And the OSCE countries, which are 57 of them right now, are much more than NATO, which is 30. And what is absolutely fundamental to these treaties which have been signed, or treaty that act and the declaration that's signed by all these countries, including Canada, is the idea of, which Putin is pushing very strongly, and Lavrov, of indivisible security for everyone, so that yes, people are free to join NATO, or they're free to join this or that pact, but it should not be at the expense of other participating states to the OSCE setup, and that for them, for Russia, they say is the fundamental thing, and with that, from their point of view, the big threat to their security has been the pushing of NATO up towards their frontiers, and they've taken a stand right now on Ukraine, on Georgia too, of course. So it's always good, it seems to me, to put oneself into the shoes of the other person. And they sent out then this draft treaty which they gave to the United States in December before Christmas, and the parallel agreement to NATO, which again they gave to the United States. They didn't bother to give it to NATO. Setting these things out in the form of a written document, because what they've been saying is that basically the verbal word from the United States is not worth a row of beans any more than it was back in 1989 to Gorbachev, not an inch further east. And that's what they've been pushing. The US reply, I feel like the NATO reply, certainly Canada and Britain working with the United States, these three countries, the Anglophones, has been to say, to change the conversation, Ukraine, and Russia being a threat to Ukraine, and there was going to be an invasion of Ukraine, and it's going to happen at 3 a.m. on February the 16th, if I recall the last date that was to take place. Of course, all this is before February 21 of yesterday. And the Russians' big thing, which is security guarantees for everyone, is lost. Now, the reason for that, it seems to me, is pretty obvious. And that is that if OSCE, as it were to run as a concept runs the show, then there's no need for NATO. And NATO for the United States is its, if I very bluntly put, is its control mechanism over its allies, particularly over Europe, above all over Germany. And so NATO is extremely important to the United States. And NATO, being a military organization, it calls itself defensive. Well, I don't know if that's really true anymore, given Afghanistan and its wish to extend out to East Asia. NATO is clearly, the NATO countries are not at one in their response to Russia. Russia sent a letter out to all the European members of the OSCE. I'm not sure whether Canada, certainly to the US, I think to Canada too, requesting a reply to very, very specifically to whether they abided by what they had signed, which is the Helsinki Act and these two declarations of Istanbul and Astana, the indivisible security aspect. Russia wants security for itself as well, is what it says, and it says it feels ganged up on. And I tell you, I can well understand that feeling in a very concrete way from my early days, not my early days, my midlife working days at the World Bank, and flying back from Thailand on one occasion, flying over the Soviet Union with joint pilots being the Soviets too. First stop Tashkent, and then Copenhagen, and the plane going on and drifting on across, landing then in Tashkent, onto Copenhagen. And it was only until we were flying over Leningrad, as then called, did the plane start its descent into Denmark. That made me feel that Western Europe is a very small tip at the end of an enormous landmass. And Russia now has the unenviable job of how to defend that landmass when it's surrounded. Well, of course, for that reason, it's tied up with China, big time, and basically external forces pushing it that way. But I think both countries happy to do so. So, coming back a bit to Nord Stream. And the need for gas, the need for energy. Not only gas, by the way. EU depends for 25% of its oil on Russian oil. Russia is the world's largest oil exporter. Forgive me, second largest oil exporter after Saudi Arabia, but only just, they're about equal. And so the French and the Germans, that's Macron and Scholz, stretched out to Russia. Macron in particular had enormously long chats in early this month in Moscow with Putin, and he was agreeing. You have every right to security too, and we agree with your concerns, and we can work with you on that. France had just taken over chairmanship of the European Council for 6 months. Now, it's very clear to me that neither the Americans or the British were enthused by this French initiative, but Scholz was going along with it a little more stolidly, was the impression I had, and with a little less imagination. But he was certainly covering the back of the French. Now we have the Americans, I think, have fairly successfully, unless I'm completely mistaken, able to turn the conversation onto a kind of a narrower but very, very important issue, which is Ukraine.
I'm not sure what Macron was proposing. My impression is that the basis for some kind of compromise or solution to the problem would, from his point of view, the Minsk agreements, that for some reason, most countries have not insisted that Ukraine abide by the commitments they made in the Minsk agreements. And his solution to the problem would be start doing it, start living up to it. Is that correct or not? Because I really haven't seen anything about what the terms are that he was proposing that people adopt.
I would comment this way. I hope I'm replying to you, Meta.
Yeah.
There are two issues. One, Minsk 2, in the I'll put in the reverse order, and the other one, the indivisible security guarantee issue, which is the overarching issue for the Russians, having been invaded by Napoleon and Hitler and the rest of it. They're very, very sensitive. So I've seen no details as to what Macron is proposing, nor have I seen how, on the security aspect, he would propose to sell whatever could be put forward to his European and American colleagues. To my mind, it was a big thing, but it still leaves the question of what are the details and how. So, but that's Macron. And as regards Minsk 2, I may be mistaken on this, but the Russians insist that were insisting until yesterday on Ukraine abiding by Minsk 2, and saying or alleging that the French and the Germans were, as part of the Normandy format, were not putting the screws on Ukraine to do so. The Ukrainians, as I understand it, subject to your better understanding, I think, is that they felt they had been shotgun into signing this Minsk 2 agreement, and they didn't really go along with it. And they were not in the least, they were foot dragging. They were not in the least interested in a federal constitution for their country. They were quite happy with the unitary. But my feeling about Ukraine is that it's and correct me on this, I would say, just to put my foot in the door, is that it's an artificial country. soldier together in the Soviet times. That's something, of course, that Putin said yesterday in his long, protracted speech prior to announcing these decrees. And with this huge language divide down the river Dnieper, as you know it, the Ukrainian language, the Russian language, and on the extreme west, the people who were shotgunned into Ukraine by Stalin from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire part and Lvov or Lviv, which is from Poland. So it's where my impression is that they don't like one another, and the only way of making Ukraine to work would be a kind of a Canadian solution. You have to get on with one another, and certainly you don't turn guns on one another. I think, to my mind, the constant shelling of the Donbass, more than by the Donbass, over the last 8 years, has been intolerable. And so, if this can be brought to an end in some peaceful fashion, even if the Russians are in there, to my mind, is saying, enough is enough to that one. But from an American point of view, it's a wonderful sting operation on the Russians to have a mess there and have them bogged down as they were once in Afghanistan, or both countries were.
But I wonder what your most hopeful solution would be. I like what you're saying about the recognition of the need for security everywhere, and not necessarily by military means. On Thursday, I'll be hosting another conversation like this. We do it during the noon hour 3 days a week. And this will be about something called peace zones. There's some people at George Mason University, at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter Center for Peace Studies or something at George Mason, who have a proposal for zones of peace in the South Caucasus and around Ukraine and areas between Western Europe and Russia that would simply, well, it's similar. I would have thought what they're talking about is really neutralizing countries, having them commit to neutrality, but apparently that's too simple a rubric for it, because there are more differences than there are similarities with neutrality. But at any rate, that's what we're going to be talking about, because it doesn't seem to me this is a very propitious time to try such a massive redesigning of international relations. But it sounds like the kind of thing that really should satisfy everybody if we just put down our guns and promise to solve things peaceably.
First of all, that your Thursday session, it sounds terrific and to the point, and that Ukraine become a neutral country like Austria or Finland and Sweden, as I've seen recommended by other people. I think Anatol Lieven, if I recall, is one. Is in Washington is a wonderful, the only way to go. I was very struck by Austria when the 4 occupying countries left just like that, and it'd be nice. But then, of course, Austria was not a fractured country that's going to fight one another.
I'm really intrigued by the concept of peace zones, and this being a possible solution in terms of the big powers taking shots at each other in the manner that John has pointed out in his commentary. I think that would be a progressive development. I certainly like the concept in terms of mutual security. And my only concern has been, though, that if you look at recent history, we have not been that successful in terms of reducing the degree of armed conflict that is taking place in the world. And I should point out as well that if you look at terrorism, you'll find that there's a direct correlation between the number of protracted armed conflicts that are taking place in the world and where terrorism takes place. And terrorism is predominantly taking place within situations of protracted armed conflict and or authoritarian regimes or totalitarian regimes in their extremist forms. So this is where you get these serious international crimes taking place. When you have protracted armed conflict, that's when you have war crimes, that's when you have crimes against humanity, that's when you have genocide taking place. In fact, there's one of the most serious international crimes is aggression. Now, amassing massive armaments and military on a country's border, does that not indicate, as some people would suggest, that they are poised for all-out attack on another country? And that is illegal. You cannot attack another country unprovoked. You can't say that Russia cannot claim that it finds Ukraine a threat, an imminent threat. And therefore, what they have to do is do a preemptive strike against the Ukrainians. This is illegal. And I know that there's a lot of toing and froing in terms of trying to protect, quote unquote, Russians within the sovereign territory of a particular state, et cetera, et cetera. That's happened before with Crimea. It's happened in other examples elsewhere. These kinds of things have to be stopped. At some point in time, appeasement does not work. I think what we have to do is take a very firm stance in terms of this and ensure that somehow there's a negotiated peace arrangement and this crisis can de-escalate.
How do you do that? When if Putin is really going to attack, how do you force him to not attack? I mean, you have a choice at this moment. I think let's assume that as of a week ago, the options were accept the Minsk agreement and implement it and live up to it, or expect to have somebody go to war against you. And I guess that Kiev has decided that they would rather have a war than to accept the terms of the Minsk agreement, which they find disagreeable, and which I don't even know whether I would find it acceptable. I wouldn't like it, but if you have a choice, one or the other, which do you pick? Am I really wrong? Okay, John.
I'm with you on that matter, and I'm empathetic to what James is saying too. I would just like to, I think, pick up the point that I'd lost my drift on, and that is, it assumes that there is the United States to mention in this matter. What a very strange thing's been going on this past week on the contact line between Ukraine and Donbass, and that is the amount of shelling, the amount of bombardment and heavy guns has gone up enormously. And according to a map produced by the OSCE, is mostly about 90% is mostly the Ukrainian shelling into Donbass. Now, the other thing is bombs going off in the cities, the main cities in Donbass, which the people there that say are saboteurs from Ukraine, and the Ukrainians deny that. So, of course, you have the fog of war here, and you have the fog of who's telling the truth. At any rate,
but I take it that you think that whatever report you're citing is correct, that it's the Ukrainians shooting the Russian separatients rather than vice versa. I
think there's a reason for this. I think, of course, they would like to take back the Donbass, but by force of arms, which seems to be a very imprudent way of trying to entice people back into a country. But the US I think has been egging them on in this. I can't put my finger on it. I just sense it, with a view to this, that it brings the Russians in. And once that's happened, as has happened, then if it does that constitute an attack on Ukraine? Depends how you define it. But if the Russians go further and trying to take more territory or try to break the Ukrainian army, or more likely the militias, the Azov battalion, that kind of crowd, at one point, sanctions get imposed. Maybe it's going to happen now. Maybe, as you say, some will be kept in reserve so that the whole impact isn't given away. It seems to me this is what the Americans have wanted all the time, is to get that Nord Stream 2 cancelled, get these sanctions really in place, and crack the Russian economy, albeit at the expense of the European economy. Much less so by US, Canada hardly affected. I would be concerned was the game. And my feeling is that now Russia is saying, who had been pressing for Minsk II until yesterday, consistently over 8 years, is enough is enough. We don't care about the sanctions, and we're going to do whatever we do, and we're not going to tell you what that's going to be. And with that, we're stuck. What do we do?
Yes. Well, and our time is almost up, but I think James should have the last word, since he's patiently listened to both of us inveigh against, inveigh against the U.S. more than anybody else, I think. James?
Well, I hope the diplomatic channels are still open, despite, Putin's speech yesterday. Mm-hmm. And despite their positions, my understanding from the most recent news reports that I've seen on CNN, they have not crossed any boundaries, even though their army is right on the border. And hopefully, United States and Russia can sit down and work out some sort of arrangement. I'm sure, I agree with John. I'm sure the situation in Europe is such where they would like to reach a peaceable agreement as well. I think no one really wants to go into armed conflict under these circumstances. So I'm the eternal optimist. I'm hoping that somehow they'll find their way, and this whole thing will de-escalate and some sort of agreement will be reached.
I think all of us and everybody watching shares your aspirations. So certainly we will try to cherish as much hope as we can maintain in this situation, which isn't too bright right now. Thank you both. Been fascinating. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode 413. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers on the comments column. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.